Okay, so welcome everybody, and thank you very much for joining today. This is I say Archaeology Scotland's first contribution ever really to International Archaeology Day. We thought this would be a really interesting talk to cover today by my colleague Edward Stewart. So I'll just tell you a little bit about Eddie, just so you know who he is. So Edward Stewart is the Clyde Valley Archaeological Research Framework Engagement Officer at Archaeology Scotland, and he has a PhD from the University of Glasgow in the archaeology of shieling landscapes across the Highlands Scotland, and has directed surveys and excavations of post-medieval shielings, hunting lodges and townships as Director of Excavations on the Glencoe Landscape and Storytelling Project. I hope you will join me in welcoming Eddie and thanking him for doing this talk today, which I hope you all find very interesting. So over to you, Eddie.
Thank you very much, Tess, for the introduction there. The title of the talk hopefully is quite explanatory, but what I'll do is I'll just share my screen so you can see my slides, and then we'll dive into it then. So my research previously has kind of looked at the kind of perceptions of Highland landscapes, how we come to understand in the contemporary the kind of nature of the Highland landscapes and settlement within these kind of uplands in the recent and not too recent past. So particularly focusing on kind of milkmaids travelling up into the hills. So it's been a recent aspect of my work, kind of moving down from those kind of highest hill passes and kind of upland bogs into the kind of straths and the valleys floors to explore kind of settlement archaeology as well. And so this is hopefully a kind of overall picture of the kind of post-medieval archaeology of Glencoe, taking us on a kind of journey from the kind of pre-massacre era, the kind of early modern, right the way through past the massacre till kind of sheep farming and clearance at the very, very kind of end of our time frame here. Now, just to, sorry if I can get my, yeah, okay. So I guess starting off, this isn't maybe a time period people quintessentially think of as archaeology. Quite often when we think of archaeology, we jump straight back to kind of chambered cairns, standing stones, and kind of deepest prehistory. So why explore an archaeology of Glencoe? Well, obviously, off the bat, Glencoe is one of the most famous and most visited glens in Scotland. So around about 2 million people a year visit, 200,000 people a year visit Glencoe. So it's a hugely trafficked place. It's portrayed on Marks and Spencer shortbread tins. It's portrayed on postcards. It's featured in many a film. It is the kind of quintessential Scottish Highland landscape. It's also a key place in the kind of development of the myth of the kind of wild, savage Highlander, which really does kind of dominate quite a lot of kind of popular media around what it means to be in the Highlands, from the Highlands, and how that kind of landscape and its archaeology and communities are perceived. It's a landscape that's been occupied for thousands and thousands of years. Now, the evidence for some of those periods is a little bit scant, but with each piece of work that we're doing, we're starting to build up a picture of what people are doing in this landscape over that kind of long duration from when the ice melts and trees start to kind of colonize this landscape and people with them, right the way through to the present day. And finally, perhaps it's quite an important case study for us thinking about, and what is a fairly kind of marginal landscape. Glencoe, there's not a massive amount of kind of cultivatable land in the glen. And in this kind of circumstance, how did kind of communities develop resilience to deal with kind of tumultuous climatic and political events, particularly over the period that we're looking at? We look at the kind of worsening of climate through the Little Ice Age, which brings about a kind of constraining of the conditions that allow for life in these landscapes in terms of the amount of ground that you can put to cultivation is limited, the areas in which you can put cattle during the summer months is limited. The seasons in which it's possible to do both of these things, grazing in the uplands and kind of growing crops in your lower parts, they are also kind of pulled in as well, and you're far more vulnerable to this kind of increase in storm events. And it's perhaps, there's lessons to be learned from this to understanding sort of what it might be like for us going forward as well into a kind of period of similar kind of climatic turmoil. And similarly, this is a period with kind of huge upheavals in identity. The Reformation and the kind of lingering after effects of that are still kind of being felt through to kind of the origins of Jacobitism in this region, and obviously with some high kind of profile examples such as the Glencoe Massacre. This is quite a tumultuous region for kind of politics as well and geopolitics, and people often kind of come to bear with what it means to live in landscapes that are kind of freshly raw as well. Just to kind of challenge then, I guess one aspect of what I'm kind of interested in challenging through this archaeology is this kind of notion of the kind of wild highlands and the wild highlander, as you know, a kind of empty wilderness akin to, you know, the American West, that's populated, at least in the past, by this kind of picture of the kind of noble savage. And you can see here some covers of various popular representations of the Highlands and Highlander roughly in this period, which give a very kind of specific picture of what it is to be a Highlander, something clearly that needs to be tamed if the covers of at least 3 of these 6 are to be believed. And these representations have their roots in those kind of pre and post romantic sort of writings about the Highlands, thinking about the kind of writings of the likes of English road engineer Edwin Burke, who writes about the kind of the purple hills of the Highlands having the disagreeable appearance of a scabbed head. There are similar kind of descriptions that go, you know, so is the climate, so is the heart of man, dictating that kind of the landscape informs or brings about a certain kind of savagery in its populations. And then even into the kind of romantic period, the likes of, you know, Wordsworth and their kind of travels, Thomas Penn and some of these other kind of travellers through the Highland landscape, Walter Scott and such, the kind of role of people and a kind of pastness of those people only really to provide a kind of scope to the massive, sublime kind of nature of the Highland landscape. The grand mountain is only really grand because there's a tiny person grazing their sheep in front of it in their kind of rudimentary house. And so there's a very particular kind of picture that has been painted and continues to be painted through kind of popular media around about what the Highlands like and what the people in the Highlands are like in this kind of 17th and 18th centuries. And we see it in Outlander, we see it in Highlander, we see it in these various novels. But hopefully, through the kind of archaeology of this land, we can start to maybe challenge some of those narratives and set out an alternative picture of this kind of connected and well, yeah, kind of very connected sort of community who are living within this region at that time. So just to give a little bit of a kind of timeline for the MacDonalds of Glencoe then, for those of you who are maybe not so aware of kind of West Highland history more broadly, and I am a historian, so or an archaeologist, sorry, not a historian, and so some of these are also slightly fuzzy to me. But somewhere around about the 1130s, we see the kind of area of Glencoe become part of that MacDonald lordship of the Isles and later of Ross, that kind of spans as a kind of major power centre in the Western Highlands and in the Hebrides as well, but also spans all the way to Northern Ireland, of course. And so you're part of a kind of regional politics that is tied up in kind of kinship as well as kind of the power that people can drive from kind of galleys and troops. And the MacDonalds within this kind of system, the MacDonalds of Glencoe, they are kind of regional players in both the kind of MacDonald clan's kind of internal politics at various points. They're involved in kind of coup and counter coup within that. But they're also involved within the kind of wider story of the kind of Western Highlands. So these kind of changing land ownership that's going on between the kind of expanding Campbells of Argyll and Campbells of Glenorchy, the MacDonalds of Keppoch, the Stewarts of Appin, and the Camerons of Killar and up towards Fort William. And so the MacDonalds, the MacDonalds of Glencoe, sorry, as quite a small clan within this picture, actually do have almost a kind of disproportionate impact. They are quite often kind of wheelers and dealers, doers of dirty deeds, or kind of switching allegiances at this point in order to kind of negotiate their position when surrounded by these far more kind of powerful clans who can raise far more men who have far closer links to kind of higher powers as well. Now, for most of the kind of certainly the 17th and or 16th and 17th centuries and their kind of earlier points, the MacDonalds of Glencoe are quite closely aligned to the Campbells of Glenorchy. They have this treaty of man rent and protection, whereby the MacDonalds of Glencoe carry out certain dark deeds on behalf of Campbell of Glenorchy, and in return, Campbell of Glenorchy sees to it that they don't really have to turn up to court to deal with the aftermath of those dark deeds. Now that ends quite sharply with the War of the Three Kingdoms, the kind of Cromwellian Wars, which are associated in Scotland, particularly with kind of Covenanter allegiances. Now, Campbell of Glenorchy sides along with Campbell of Argyll initially with the kind of Covenanter and Cromwellian kind of forces, and that forces a kind of break between MacDonald of Glencoe, who, like many of the other kind of clans in that area, the MacDonalds of Keppoch, Camerons of Killart, and Stuarts of Appin, side with the king. And so this starts this kind of period in which they're at odds then with their kind of traditional allies, their traditional kind of feudal superiors. This comes to a kind of head at first with the 1685 Monmouth Rebellion, which is if I get this right now, this is the illegitimate son of Charles II, who challenges James VII's claim to the throne. And this is kind of drawn along religious lines. Campbell of Argyll rises with Monmouth and is quite rapidly slapped down for that. MacDonald of Glencoe and many of the other kind of regional MacDonalds are involved in raids into Campbell of Argyll's lands, during which they acquire quite a substantial portion of booty, but they also put themselves at odds with what is a very, very powerful regional clan. The Campbells of Argyll are very, very closely tied to kind of regional politics, and particularly once the kind of Williamite Wars have started and William of Orange is put in place as king, this puts them at odds with one of the kind of major powers of the country at that time. Obviously, in 1689, we have the Glorious Revolution, as some might put it, or the arrival of William of Orange to usurp James the Seventh of Scotland. And with that comes Bonnie Dundee, Viscount Claverhouse, his campaign on behalf of the exiled James VII, which might be considered to be the kind of first of the Jacobite risings at this point. MacDonald of Keppoch and MacDonald of Glencoe are out in this rising, and they're both there at Killiecrankie in the kind of final action, which sees Bonnie Dundee killed during the kind of famous charge. They're there at Dunkeld for the kind of fairly consequential lack of a victory, shall we say. The Jacobites kind of melt off before the battle can really be won. And so on the way home, they proceed to carry out a kind of revenge raiding of Campbell lands that they pass along the way. And particularly one of the characters that we'll kind of come up to again, Campbell of Glenlyon, who's actually closely married to the MacDonalds of Glencoe, but they raid his house in Glenlyon on the way home. And this is quite financially ruinous for him, for a man who's already quite a drinker, quite a gambler, and thus quite a debtor. This is kind of the nail in the coffins of his financial stakes at this point. But they also raid the houses of Campbell of Glenorchy as well, and so Auchalader Castle by Loch Tulla is burnt down at this moment as well. And this is to set the kind of scene for what goes on next with 1692 and the Massacre of Glencoe, which I'll go into in a little bit more detail once we get to it. Just to give a kind of mapping of this then, so for those of you kind of vaguely familiar with the Western Highlands, we're here kind of at the kind of edge point between Lochaber and Argyll, an area called, generally kind of referred to as North Lorne, at least in its kind of southern portions there, but we have North Ballachulish, which forms the kind of crossing point between, which is marked on this map, between the lands of the kind of Camerons of Killart into the Stuarts of Appin, who have South Ballachulish. And then across we have MacDonald of Glencoe, whose lands essentially kind of shadow the modern A82, the main kind of trunk road. But you can see their position quite delicately poised between the MacDonalds of Keppoch, the Camerons of Killart, the Stuarts of Appin, Campbell of Argyll, and Campbell of Glenorchy as well. We're in this kind of pinch point where they are in quite a kind of constrained position. And each of these clans also kind of has effusive rights to grazings on Rannochs as well, and Rannoch Moor as well, which is just to the west of this area. And so that leads to kind of tensions between the different groups, between who has rights to which areas of shealing ground, cattle being such an important resource in this period. So some of the kind of key sites and stories I'll explore through this talk are what's going on in those upland landscapes, in the hills and in the side glens of Glencoe, those kind of tributary glens, what's going on up there, and what kind of picture can we paint of the kind of economic and social value of the uplands. We'll move then down into the kind of heart of the glen and have a look at the townships of Glencoe and the kind of main winter settlements of the clans, the kind of agricultural lands. We'll explore a little bit the archaeology of the Massacre of 1692, and then we'll think a little bit about what was it like to return to this Glen of Sorrows, as it's often named. But what is it like to return to a landscape in which something so traumatic has happened? so recently. We know the MacDonalds of Glencoe are back in Glencoe and kind of rebuilding their houses and their lives less than a year after the massacre. And so what was that like to kind of conceptualise, and what is the archaeology of that return? So starting off in the upland landscapes there, and we've done quite a comprehensive programme of survey across much of the upland landscapes, including the fringes of Rannoch Moor and the various tributary glens of Glencoe, so Larragilge, Larraggarten and Glenlach Unfortunately, the remaining tributary glen has been so heavily afforested in the 20th century that the deep ploughing has rather removed any archaeology. But what the picture that we kind of get from these landscapes then is that they are actually really, really important to the economies of the communities of this landscape, to their kind of subsistence practices. Each year, with the kind of marginal agricultural land that you have within the glen, you have to get your cattle out and away before they're grazing on your growing barley. And so the uplands are where they're going. They're sending the women and the children to take the cattle up into these kind of upland passes, into the fringes of Rannoch Moor, and they're grazing the cattle there. Cattle being so important as a kind of key economic resource in this period, both for their dairy products, but also as part of kind of droving trade, being sent down to feed the markets of kind of Glasgow, Crieff and Falkirk, and then eventually also, obviously, in the kind of later points, that's feeding into the kind of economies of slave plantations in the Caribbean and the kind of West Indies, but also feeding the kind of Royal Navy, salted beef being a key part of their rations, and the Highlands being one of the key suppliers of that. So there's a kind of agricultural practice that's going on within these uplands. Another thing that's going on is field gathering. So trees being fairly scarce already by this point in much of the Western Highlands, and those that are there being quite heavily managed. Timber isn't really a resource that you're using to burn as kind of fuel in your house. At best, you have kind of rights to gather some to replace your roof timbers every wee while. But even then, it does seem like roof timbers get moved from house to house in order to not let them go to waste when they're kind of renovating or restoring a house, when they're going up to the ceilings to fix them and returning again. And so peat, which is the kind of degrading and breaking down of sphagnum moss out on these kind of vast upland wetlands, that is the main fuel. You're burning sods of peat. And to do this, you have to it's quite a labour-intensive process. You have to travel up to the uplands, you have to cut your peats in the spring or late spring, early summer. You have to allow them to dry over the summer months, and then you have to carry them back down the hill again, back to your kind of townships. And so this is quite a kind of labour-intensive process that at various points is bringing pretty much the whole community up to these kind of what we might now consider to be empty, wild wastes. But actually, these are the centre of kind of really important economies of fuel and subsistence in this period. Another thing that's going on in these upland landscapes, though, is sort of elite hunting activity as well. And so we can see evidence for sort of chiefly hunting going on across the kind of uplands of this region. We know Corrie Ba on Rannoch Moor is certainly one of the kind of key hunting forests of the Campbells of Glenorchy, and prior to that, it has kind of royal hunting status. The Forest of Buckle to the eastern end of Glencoe is also a royal hunting forest at a certain period, certainly in the kind of high medieval potentially. And the MacDonalds of Glencoe themselves have their own hunting camps and kind of networks of hunting that are going on within Glenlach na Muir, so one of these kind of tributary glens that runs off from the main glen in Glencoe. And this is one of the sites that we've explored through excavation. It was previously kind of known as the Summer House of McKeon or the Chief's Shieling, and we were really interested to know, what does a summer house mean in the context of kind of 17th century chiefly status? What is the kind of role of these spaces? What's going on within this? What is a chief's shieling? And we do have some sort of documentary evidence that's passed down to us. So we have this song that's likely written in the sort of mid-17th, later 18th century, which speaks about the kind of MacDonald of Glencoe retinue of the chief travelling up to the summer residences. And that may well be that they're talking about this very structure that we've excavated. But you can see from our plan drawing here, this structure has quite a substantial slab floor. It has substantial stone walls, and it seems to have some kind of divisions of space going on within it as well. But one of the really key features is this beautiful gable end fireplace that's made out of two levered up orthostatic stones. So those two big kind of rectangular slabs levered up against the back wall with this really nice footing around. You can see those really grand slab floor as well. I mean, some of these slabs are over a metre in scale, and they're beautiful slabs of kind of worked schist. So they're quite sparkly. They're quite impressive. This is a dwelling, a structure that's designed to impress those that are coming up to it. And that gable end fireplace as well. If we're thinking houses in this period, quite often have a a fireplace in the centre of the house. That's the kind of democratised, that's your usual kind of byre house. You have your central fire that everyone gathers around in the winter, and people are doing craft activities, telling stories, etc., doing a bit of the cooking over it. This structure has this gable end fireplace. It's quite a different politics of space. If you think about it, this echoes far more the kind of feasting halls of the kind of tower houses and castles of far better resourced clans. Thinking about the Stuarts of Appin have their tower houses on Shuna Island and it's Castle Stalker in near Port Appin. This is the kind of MacDonalds of Glencoe on the very limited resource scale that they have, because they are a far smaller clan, but they are still trying to kind of echo what it means, the kind of architecture and the material culture of a far higher status clan. What does it mean to be a chief? And this is them trying to kind of perform that within this space. We see quite early evidence for the kind of importing of elite goods. So particularly tobacco pipes from a fairly early stage, early 17th century, are coming into this site. And that's quite interesting when we think about, this idea that these are kind of backward savages. I mean, at certain points, the communities of this area are being described as wolves with two legs. They are kind of lawless folk, barely above animals at points in their kind of behaviour, as they're being written about by kind of lowlanders and English visitors to the area. And yet they're quite connected to like the very first arrival of tobacco in Scotland. Not long after that, someone in the chief's hunting lodge in Glencoe is having a puff on a pipe and is trying it for themselves. And so these are quite connected people. And we get that picture especially from the pottery from this site. So this has been described as one of the richest pottery assemblages from a rural site in Scotland from the 17th century. It's a spectacular array of German, Southern Scandinavian, English, French and Low Countries pottery, as well as some from the east of Scotland. But you can see here amongst the sherds, there are pieces of the really kind of rich green Beauvais ware from northern France. There are pieces of German stonewares from Rheren, Siegburg, Westerwald, and various other kind of Rhenish pottery centres as well. We've got Bartman jugs for importing wine. We've got wine serving jugs. We've got grand redware plates. We've got Staffordshire slipwares. And we've got Vesterwald tankards. So these are some of the kind of flashiest dining accoutrements that one could acquire at this point in time. So that idea of MacIan and his kind of his clan as a kind of shower of savages away up in the hills couldn't really be further from the case. I mean, this is the material culture you would expect of a castle site. Elan Donnan has a far less impressive, from the excavations, it seems to have a far less impressive dining set than MacIan does in his summer house, which is only, of course, a secondary residence too. This is a really, really rich assemblage of pottery, and it's clearly there to impress. This is dining to impress. And who is he impressing? Well, if you're a chief in this kind of period, you have to demonstrate your chiefliness. This isn't at a point in which the kind of status of chief is handed down from father to son directly. It often is, but if you prove yourself to be unchiefly, then you can quite easily be replaced for an uncle, a brother, another male relative who has similar claim. Chiefliness has to be performed and it has to be confirmed. And you're doing this through displays of generosity. You're doing this through carrying out grand hunts into the uplands. And again, conceptualising what a hunt is in this period is quite a different thing. So imagine we're gathering together groups of 200, 300. It's almost like you're gathering together all the tenants that you would if you were going to war, and you're driving them up into the hills. There's shot, there's bows and arrows, there's horses and hounds, and there's a pursuit across the landscape. And this is a really kind of logistically challenging thing to organise, but it's also a kind of bringing together of your clan and a performance of your kind of martial capability, your strength, and kind of warlike capability. Also within the structure, we see evidence for kind of gambling and gaming, and this is another part that seems to have been really key to kind of performing your chiefliness. Both in the winning, you show your wit, and in the losing, you show your good humour and generosity as well. And so we have evidence for potentially games of kind of checkers. We've got counters broken, napped out of pieces of broken pottery, and we have pieces of slate gaming board with kind of grids scratched onto them. This seems to be the kind of material culture of gambling and gaming within this structure as well. This is just a little kind of reconstruction drawing to give a sense of what that structure might be like. But if we imagine that gable end fireplace again, it's quite a different kind of politics of the space. The chief at the head of the table and his guests arrayed beyond him, in kind of order of their rank and significance. You get this kind of hierarchical use of that space, and everyone knows quite clearly where they sit in comparison to their chief. One of the key finds from this site as well that kind of confirms that status and shows us some of the kind of connections of the clans in this era is the Glencoe hoard. So this is a hoard of 36 silver and bronze coins, as well as a few other weird and wonderfuls, that was recovered from within the fireplace of this house. So the sequence of events that seems to have occurred, the structure is in its moment of abandonment, or just after its abandonment. The fire is swept out, the hearth slab is lifted, a hole's dug. This pot of coins, which is part of a German stoneware sort of wine pot, which seems to have had its neck reshaped to fit this little kind of stone stopper. The 36 coins are deposited within the pot. That's laid underneath the fire. They then place the slab back on top, but they don't ever burn the fire again. And so, no one's staying in a structure like this in the hills of Glencoe. I mean, I've been there even in the summer, and God forbid I wouldn't want to stay in a house like this without a fireplace. So clearly no one's returning to this house afterwards. Now, they then kind of infill the area above the stone, the stone hearth slab, with a kind of layer of soil that's maybe gathered from the kind of interior earth-stamped floor in the kitchen area of this structure. And within that, they then deposit two spindle whorls, two very nice, richly decorated spindle whorls. Are these being deposited potentially as a result of the aftermath of the Glencoe Massacre? And are these kind of personal artifacts that are being deposited to represent the kind of chief's household as it was when the massacre occurs? Alexander McKeon, the chief of the MacDonalds of Glencoe in the 1690s, and his wife both die in the events of the massacre. And there's the potential that 36 was the number that was one of the numbers initially reported for the number who die in the Glencoe Massacre. Is there a coin for every person who died, perhaps? Is this McKeon's personal coin collection quite a human act in which we see, this personal artifact being kind of deposited along with the kind of closing of this space that's associated with him, perhaps the spindle whorls associated with his wife, as part of the kind of coming to terms with what it means to have lived through the massacre? That's one way that we might read this. Now, the coins themselves are really quite interesting. They're not your standard coin hoard. They're not actually worth very much money at all. The silver's quite low value silver in reality. It's probably not even the gathered rents of Glencoe at the time. But some of the coins, by the point of their deposition, are over 100 years old. We've got Henry VIII, we've got Mary of Guise, we've got Elizabeth I of England. We have coins that span from the Papal States. We've got a quadrino from the Papal States, a bronze coin, which presumably would have had no value in Scotland at this point. We have a jeton, so an accounting token, not even a coin, from the French Royal Palace. We have coins from Spain and the Spanish Netherlands. And a coin weight as well, that kind of shiny, deceptively looks a bit like gold, but alas is brass coin in the far right there. There's quite a weird array of coins going on here, and what did they mean? Are these being collected on travels to the continent? We know that McKeon, who dies in 1692, he was educated at the Scots College in Paris, potentially, as part of his education, or he was educated in Paris. His father was potentially educated in Rome. And certainly other Scots from this region are going off to be educated both in Lowland Scotland, but also in the kind of wider kind of Scots colleges and Scots networks across Europe as well, from the Low Countries to Spain, from Rome to Paris. Among the other coins, there's some kind of weird and wonderfuls going on as well. And so we have, this is just to show some of those coins that are coming from kind of far-flung places in greater detail. But we also have some quite weird and wonderful coins within this collection that are quite unique, perhaps, to other coin hoards that we see. And so this is the only coin hoard from a Scottish context that has both halves of a halved coin. Now, you can half a coin to half its value. That is a practice that's going on, but it's certainly kind of tailed off by this period where we have a kind of infusion of more and more values of currency are being kind of produced. Also, 4 of the coins from the hoard have been kind of perforated as if to be worn, perhaps as part of a belt or a garment or as part of an amulet. Now, we know that coins in this period have a series of different meanings. They're not just money. They can have other meanings. So coins obviously often represent the king as one of the kind of figures on them. And certainly for the Stuart kings, they are considered to be kind of kings divinely appointed. They have special kind of properties as the kind of legal intercessor between you and God. There's this kind of notion that the touch of a Stuart king can provide kind of healing qualities. And this is interesting that those sorts of properties aren't necessarily transmuted once we go to the kind of William and then the Georges, the kind of House of Orange and the Hanoverian kings. But certainly in this kind of 17th century, there's a certain power to kind of representations of the king. Coins can also have representations of the cross. And so the top left image has a coin of the Cromwellian Commonwealth, which features the cross of St. George and an Irish harp. But again, that could have been worn as a kind of amulet. It's got an image of the cross. The breaking of coins can be obviously to split their value, as I'd mentioned earlier, but it can also mean to kind of make a promise or swear an oath, and you split the coin which represents the king or the cross, and as such you've kind of sworn an oath with kind of God and the king as witness in a way. And so what does it mean then to have two halves of a half coin back again together? There's some quite interesting questions we might explore about why this kind of collection has been curated together. It's clearly a weird collection of coins, and thus it's probably not really a kind of financial hoarding of wealth so much as a kind of meaningful collection of coins, a bit like if your father or grandfather or grandparents had travelled off kind of around Europe in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and they've brought back coins from the various places they visited. This is perhaps a kind of similar, very human act of kind of coin collecting and telling stories with coins, using that to kind of confirm your worldliness and your well-travelled nature, your connections and your family history through a kind of pile of coins. We'll move down then from the uplands to the kind of lower parts of Glencoe. So this is Roy's map, which was produced in the 1750s, but it provides a really nice record of what the kind of township landscape of Glencoe looked like. The red dots are the townships that are marked on Roy's map. The green dots are the kind of shieling sites that we've identified, or shieling clusters that we've identified within Glencoe from survey. And the blue sites are additional townships that we know of from historical maps or from survey that probably date to around about the mid-18th century. So we can see that while Roy is relatively comprehensive, there are some gaps in his kind of mapping, and these might be structures that had fallen out of use before or after his kind of period as well. But what we do see is that this is actually a really busy landscape. That idea of Glencoe as a kind of austere and empty place couldn't be further from the truth. Almost every inch of the glen is cultivated, is occupied, is farmed and enclosed in various ways that kind of speak to quite an intensity of management within this landscape. And this is the township of Achnacawn, which is where we've been focusing a lot of our work recently. So for 2014 and 2015, we've been there for a fortnight each summer, excavating various features within the landscape. So we've excavated a 17th and an 18th century tacksman's house. We've excavated platforms and corn drying kilns, 17th century tenants' houses and potentially 18th century tenants' houses, and areas of cultivation as well, to try and better understand how people are managing this township, how they're living within these townships, what their material culture is like, and how we can kind of read their status and connections from that. So to start off then, I guess we have a 17th century tenants' house to be excavated this year. We can see it's a rather interesting structure in that it has 3 stone walls and a turf wall. So perhaps it's a house halfway through a period of grand designs where it's getting renovations done. And they're partially through this process when the house is abandoned. And we have a quite clear abandonment within this structure of the end of the 17th century, a suspicious date for Glencoe. From within this structure, we've had some quite nice material. So the white glazed pottery in the top right, that's probably 18th century, and it was deposited within the kind of collapse of the structure. So clearly at a certain point, people start to dump their domestic waste within this kind of ruin that's upstanding, or at least partially there within the landscape. But the material that seems to be kind of dating to the occupation of this structure is this kind of quite chunky, what we would call reduced ware to the far left there. So you can see these pieces of quite poorly fired pottery that's potentially being produced locally or in the kind of wider sort of West Highland region. And then we've got one nice piece of what's potentially a kind of Staffordshire slipware as well. So even at the kind of status of the tin, we do have fairly key connections that are kind of being annotated. I mean, this is coming from this is coming from kind of the sort of southern portions of England around kind of Staffordshire direction, and being imported up that kind of west coast trade routes. And bear in mind, that's kind of a contrast to, well, we did have some Staffordshire and some kind of West Coast connections seen in the pottery from the summer house, say. The vast majority of that was German, Southern Scandinavian and Eastern Scottish and the Low Countries. So there is a kind of slightly weird thing going on whereby Glencoe seems to look to the kind of Hanseatic League and the North Sea trade routes rather than necessarily to the kind of traditional trade routes up the west of Scotland. There's a slight oddity that's going on there. But certainly here we do see perhaps a slightly more limited range of kind of material culture that would be as we would expect of a kind of someone of a tenants class within one of these townships. We've more widely excavated the tacksman's house now, as of this season, and we have this quite substantial turf-built structure. You can just about see the kind of curve of the wall there, particularly to the north. It's highlighted quite nicely by the existence of that quite bulky drain. The drain was packed full of pottery, which I'll show you in a wee moment. But within this structure, we also have something quite interesting that might suggest it's been occupied for quite a long time. So within the structure, we have evidence for pieces of probably residual or potentially heirloom 13th and 14th century pottery. So this is some of the earliest pottery or material from Glencoe in its entirety, because the archaeology of Glencoe is rather truncated. We know that there's some prehistoric activity, though there's never yet been found a particularly convincing prehistoric site within Glencoe itself. We know that there's definitely a medieval period, because we have kind of historical evidence to suggest it, but there hasn't yet been a medieval structure found within Glencoe either. But within this structure, we have a series of 3 hearths within the floor, 2 of which have been sealed with stones, and the third one which was left open at the time of its abandonment. Within these hearths, as within some kind of ritual deposits within the structure, like the base of postals, we found silver coins. And there's a question of, are these kind of being used to kind of ritually close particular kind of phases in the life of this structure? You know, a tacksman dies, they seal his fireplace, and they move the fireplace a little bit to the west and start again, is perhaps one way you could put it. And perhaps there's a kind of moving towards the gable end of the house again. You'll see the final fireplace is up towards the far western edge of this house. Is that kind of echoing the architecture of the chief's summer house at the same time? There's a kind of attempt to kind of move towards a kind of gable end fireplace and the kind of status that might suggest at this period. This structure, again, why we know it's a tacksman's house is it's a really, really rich assemblage of pottery from this. This is, again, a really impressive set of connections that are being demonstrated. There's Eastern, Scottish and Scandinavian redwares, potentially some from the Low Countries too. There is pottery from the sort of German stonewares, including pieces of potentially kind of heirloom, quite high status material. So is material being kind of gifted from the chief to his close relatives, the tacksman. There's also pieces of kind of Staffordshire pottery, which would, again, coming up that kind of West Coast connection, and a substantial portion of northern French pottery as well, Beauvais wares. But other material as well, whetstones and lead spindle whorls of nicely decorated designs. Similar status perhaps represented to that's going on in the kind of chief's summer house. So there's something interesting going on within this setting as well. And this is the kind of array of coins that we had from within those kind of in situ and during the life of this structure. So the 5 across the top are from the most recently excavated hearth. The silver coin in the bottom left is from a postal, so it perhaps denotes the kind of founding of this structure or one of the phases of its redevelopment. And the 3 to the right were found in an earlier hearth within the structure as well. But these are all roughly from the kind of period of James to Charles II. What dates this structure's abandonment for us, or at least its last phase of occupation, is a rather interesting scatter of coins, which I'll get to in just a moment, that were found across the floor of this structure. But these are some of the connections that we can see so far from that kind of pre-18th century phase of activity within Glencoe. We see this really broad set of connections. So we've got pottery and wine coming from all across continental Europe, tobacco coming from the Americas, and a variety of materials being brought from across Scotland as well. So this is a really, really richly connected landscape as well. And then we have the Massacre of Glencoe. So in 1692, and the 13th of February, troops who have been stationed with the MacDonalds of Glencoe, which is a fairly common practice in this period. So, you know, instead of paying your rent or your taxes to the government, they might kind of have you put up troops who'd be billeted within your houses. It was a fairly run-of-the-mill thing, particularly in periods of upheaval like this was. And bear in mind, in 1692, the MacDonalds of Keppoch, just further around, are still, as of yet, not decided for King William. The run-up to the Massacre of Glencoe is quite a kind of interesting story in itself, and it picks out, perhaps contrary to some of the kind of popular narratives around it, exactly how the MacDonalds of Glencoe come to be singled out for this act. So, as I'd mentioned earlier, at the end of the 1690 kind of or 1689 rises by Bonnie Dundee and the kind of campaigns that lead up to Killiecrankie and Dunkeld. On the way home from that, MacDonald of Keppoch, MacDonald of Glencoe go on a kind of burning and pillaging spree through the Campbell lands that they pass, perhaps earning them a few more enemies along the way. Now, King William, when he's finally kind of defeated the last of the kind of Jacobite supporting forces at the Battle of the Boyne during the kind of Irish campaigns, he's keen to get the submission of all those clans who haven't yet given him their approval, their oaths of allegiance. And so he puts out, Campbell of Glenorchy is put in charge of this. A pot of money is delivered to his castle at Achallada at Loch Tula. Still a bit of a ruin from the MacDonald of Glencoe and MacDonald of Keppoch's raid upon it. And essentially, the clans of this region are told to submit to William of Orange by a set date, or they're in trouble. Now, MacDonald of Glencoe hangs on, waits for the kind of permission from King James the 7th that this is all right, that this is okay, this isn't breaking oaths. And King James eventually gives this permission. Now, MacIan sets off to give his oath. He heads off to Fort William, where there's a government garrison. And he arrives just in time to give his oath, apart from the fact that he can't give it in Fort William. He's got this wrong, and he has to head all the way down to Inverary on the other side of Argyll through blizzards, meaning that he arrives too late to give his oath. Now, he has a letter from Colonel Hill, the commander of the garrison at Fort William, which says that he tried to get there in time. He was just a few hundred miles off, unfortunately. And so his oath is accepted at that time. Now, the Secretary of State for Scotland, Dalrymple, is looking to kind of set an example among the Highland clans, and the MacDonalds of Glencoe seem to particularly pick his ardour. Perhaps this is due to his kind of connections to Campbell of Argyll and Campbell of Glenorchy. But MacDonald of Glencoe has decided to be the kind of obvious candidate to kind of face the government's wrath. The fact that his oath submitted too late is just the kind of ammunition that they need. And why do they pick the MacDonalds of Glencoe? Well, in particular, it is because of their kind of small their kind of small power compared to their kind of regional neighbours. So the Stuarts of Appin, who are also kind of rebellious at this point, are far too large a clan to successfully manage something like this. The same for the MacDonalds of Keppoch, who are out and out in this period. And so MacDonald of Glencoe has decided for this. So 120 troops are garrisoned with the MacDonalds of Glencoe, including MacIan himself and his various sons and such, when on the 13th of February, in the small hours of the morning, the massacre begins. And one of the stories that we have from Glencoe, which we can kind of tell a bit of an archaeological story around, is that of the tacksman of Achnacawn. So the tacksman of Achnacawn, that settlement that we've excavated, the house that we've excavated, he's a close relative of the chief. I think he's a cousin, if I recall. And on the night of the massacre, his brother, who's the tacksman of Achshuachtan, the next settlement up the glen, and many of his tenants are over in his house kind of discussing. The troops have been moving around. They're a bit unnerved by this. They've been told that the troops are just getting ready to head off to quell the rebellion amongst the MacDonalds of Keppoch. But there's a little bit of uncertainty around this. It comes to around about 3 a.m. when musket shots rail through the windows of the house, and the door is booted down and a volley of shots fires through the door. Now, MacDonald of Achshuachtan and many of the tenants are killed in this kind of first volley, but MacDonald of Achnacawn is only injured. His once guests turned would-be assassins pull him outside and prepare to shoot him against the wall of his own house. And in that moment, he rips off his cloak, his plaid, and he tosses it over his would-be assailants. Their shots go awry, and he manages to escape off into the hills. And so he's one of the survivors and witnesses to the massacre of Glencoe that appears then in the court transcripts and inquiries afterwards. And while we were excavating at Achnacawn, in the kind of kale yard, the garden plot associated with that tacksman's house, we did find a bent plaid pin just outside the door. Now, we can't say for certain that is MacDonald of Achnacawn's plaid pin, but it certainly makes quite a poignant story and a poignant kind of connection materially or otherwise. Another thing that we found on the floor of the tacksman's house is this scatter of coins. Where these dropped in that initial volley, were they, part of coins that were being kind of gambled and shared over the kind of night before the massacre occurs. There's a range of coins from the kind of Charles I, Charles II, one early William and Mary coin, and perhaps most interestingly of all, a piece of James VII Irish gun money. So this is money that's being minted in order to provide payment to Jacobite troops fighting in Ireland. And you can see perhaps in the top right of my slides there that the date of this coin is 1690, so only 2 years before the massacre of Glencoe. And now this seems to be the last activity that goes on within this structure. These are in the kind of topmost floor layer before we see the abandonment. So we can date the abandonment of this structure to within 2 years of the Glencoe Massacre, and that's pretty close. And again, this speaks to quite a close Jacobite allegiance. Someone potentially from this structure, either MacDonald of Achnacairn himself or one of his kind of tacksmen, his relatives, or sorry, one of his tenants or his relatives, has been off fighting for the Jacobite cause in Ireland. So even post the kind of defeat of the Scottish clans, they've continued on that kind of Jacobite flame, which is really, really interesting. So what is it like to return then to this landscape? We know that about a year after the massacre, the MacDonalds of Glencoe are finally given permission to return to their homes and to start rebuilding their lives within this glen. And this brings about some changes to the kind of power structure of Glencoe. We know that certain townships, although most of the tenants remain MacDonalds of Glencoe, the actual kind of management of them and their ownership shifts to the Stewarts of Appin. So there's a kind of shrinking in of the kind of MacDonald power within Glencoe. And Achnacairn latterly is one of those townships which becomes a Stewart township rather than a MacDonald township. But there is a kind of initial phase of returning to Glencoe that must have happened for the MacDonalds. And we know that MacDonald of Achnacairn is one of those who's kind of returning after the massacre. What's it like to kind of live in a landscape where the kind of very visible ruins of this traumatic event are still there? And potentially, these turf structures that were being occupied before the massacre are just kind of slowly melting back into the landscape over this period of the kind of early 18th century. And what is it like then to be in this landscape that has these kind of very like visible reminders of the kind of sorrowful events that have occurred, those kind of traumatic events, and perhaps that has some relevance to kind of contemporary events. What will it be like to kind of return to places of such kind of severe trauma, for communities in the present? But this is just to give a kind of reconstruction drawing of what that may have looked like with those structures that we know date to the 18th century drawn in, and the 17th century structures lying in ruin, the agricultural landscapes once again reoccupied, and giving a sense perhaps of the kind of busyness and yet quietness of that landscape in the same moment. And back to Achnacairn then, and there's some of the sort of structures that we've excavated as I showed you earlier, but we have these two structures that date firmly to the 18th century, which we can kind of explore. And this clearly kind of retains a living landscape. We get this idea often that's kind of portrayed that Glencoe is depopulated in the massacre. That's it. The people die or are displaced, and that is really the kind of end of Glencoe as a living landscape. It becomes the Glen of Sorrow. But we know that actually it's very busy and occupied right the way through into the kind of later 18th century as well. We know that a substantial number of men are raised from Glencoe to go and fight even in the 1745 Jacobite risings. And so this remains quite an occupied landscape right the way through into the 18th century. And it's only really with clearance that it comes to be depopulated. So this is a mid-18th century house in Achnacairn as we've excavated it so far. And potentially this again represents a kind of tacksman's house. There's certainly a substantial quantity of glass being imported in. We know that someone within this township is importing rum and ends up becoming somewhat in arrears of payments for it from a Stewart merchant round the coast. There are gun flints, there's an iron knife, there's clay tobacco pipes, a copper alloy sewing needle as well. This is a lived-in place. We can see the kind of features of the house, drains to kind of take the effluent from the cattle out of your house and away, the hearth where people would have sat and worked around of evenings, have sat, cooked, and kind of told stories and such as well. We have the kind of remains of the walls and the drainage ditches associated with the house as well. And one particularly interesting find that we got from this structure as well is this. So this is a piece of a clay tobacco pipe that dates probably from the later 1740s or 1750s. And now this is of a style that's previously never been found in Scotland before. The sort of stamped armorial on the front of it there is the Hanoverian coat of arms with a motto. And this is a type of tobacco pipe that was only produced and sold and distributed to government garrisons, particularly in the south of England. And so is this part of the kind of post-1745-46 rising when there's policing going on within the Highlands, the actions of the Butcher Cumberland, but also the more kind of peaceful billeting of troops within these townships again. And what might it have been like if you were one of those folk who were, alive perhaps as a child or as a young man or woman in the 1690s who remembered the events of the Glencoe Massacre to again have troops billeted within your townships? There's something quite interesting in that and perhaps kind of traumatic as well in that moment of a familiar set of circumstances come again. From what we know, the township of Achnacairn is cleared somewhere between the 1760s and the 1820s, perhaps as a kind of series of stages that see it turn from a township with multiple kind of tenants spread out across and managed by a tacksman to a sheep farm with the sort of sheep farmer as the kind of local landowner and his bothy lads, who would have done much of the kind of shepherding in the landscape as well. And this is the kind of process by which Glencoe comes to be as we see it today, with largely the upper portion of the glen depopulated and most of the people who live in Glencoe now living in the kind of crofting settlement down at Carnoch. And there's a kind of archaeology to this process as well. One of the slightly kind of interesting phases of activity that we get from this kind of latter 18th century is up in the uplands again, very close to the summer house of McKeon, up in those kind of tributary glens beyond Glencoe, within a shealing hut that seems to have been abandoned by the radiocarbon dating around the mid 18th century. We see a kind of phase of reoccupation of this structure that seems to be related to a rather sneaky set of acts. So around about the end of the 18th century, we see laws brought in to control the production of whisky in the Highlands. The lowland distilleries have been complaining that they are being outcompeted by the untaxable Highlanders. And so the production of spirits on a domestic level for sale is effectively outlawed. And this leads to a real boom of illicit whisky stilling, rather similar to the production of kind of moonshine or poitín in its kind of process, that springs up across the Highlands. Think about it at this point. This is at the kind of core of the Revolutionary and the Napoleonic Wars. The supplies of other high-status spirits and fortified wines, sherry and brandy and port, are effectively blockaded by the French. You're not getting the same supplies of those that the kind of well-to-do of Britain would have otherwise had. And so there's a sudden spike in demand for whisky, to the extent that even during the King's visit to Edinburgh, championed by Walter Scott, it's a Glenlivet whisky, an illicitly stilled whisky that the King asks for as a kind of connoisseur of the drinks. And so this is a kind of interesting structure that we excavated a few years ago, but it tells a very specific social story of that kind of resistance to taxation and government enforcement on the kind of production of a traditional spirit, but also perhaps the bothy lads or the sheep farmers of Glencoe coming to try and generate some income so that they can pay their rents in cash. And doing that through perhaps being coerced into participating in the production of illicit whisky. But this was a really interesting site to be able to kind of pick out a slightly different element of the kind of story of Glencoe. And the fact that people are still within these landscapes, these places that we might think of as empty, even into the kind of later 18th, early 19th centuries. What's really important though, and this event or this talk is part of that, but what we're really keen to do is make sure that these kind of stories that we're telling, these really important narratives that challenge notions of kind of upland Highland emptiness, that challenge those notions of the wild Highlands and the wild Highlander, that we can tell those tales to as many people as possible. So each year when we carry out our excavations, we carry out an open day, which we get. This year we had 1,785 visitors too, but we normally get in the region of that each year. And we host site tours while we're excavating. This year we hosted 250 drop-in site visitors, as well as members of local societies and heritage groups from across the country. We had local and visiting volunteers as well. Some of the people on the call perhaps were among those who've supported us at various points, but this year we supported 30 volunteers and approximately 1,000 hours of volunteering time. We also ran fieldwork sessions with Kinloch, Leven, Glencoe, St Bride's, Ballyhalish, Onich and Jura primary schools. Around about 52 pupils were brought out to site and engaged with us. And we also had partnerships with the local high schools from Lochaber and the West Highlands, including Kinloch, Leven, Lochaber, Mallaig and Ardnamurchan high schools as well, and ran workshops for our volunteers and students on geophysics, numismatics, which is the study of coins, soil science, and pottery as well. I'll see briefly if I can get rid of some of the annotations. Let me share again. Oh, there we go. So I guess just to finish off then, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions. So this is a project that's co-directed by myself, but also Derek Alexander from the National Trust for Scotland. I see our artists back. Professor Michael Given, Dr. Nicole Smith, Dr. Elizabeth Robertson, Dr. Gareth Beale, and from the University of Glasgow, and myself from Archaeology Scotland as well, obviously. You can find out more about the project by following our mailing list, which the QR code is there. I can also add a link in the chat. But yeah, that's just to say that is a way that you can kind of follow along with updates from the project. We have publications coming out at various points and kind of wider updates. But I'll wrap up there and we can maybe go into some question and answer if anyone has any questions at all.
There aren't any particular questions. Well, there's one question, apologies, in the chat function, and it says, was there any reaction against the clans and the soldiers after the massacre?
So there was a government inquiry that was held. So essentially, in the aftermath of the massacre, this turns out to be somewhat of a kind of PR coup for the Jacobite side in a way. So instead of causing the kind of quelling of the Highland clans as it's kind of intended to be, in fact, it obviously kind of ignites many kind of furies among different aspects of the clan. It kind of really brings together the MacDonald diaspora as well in quite an interesting way. So previously, there had been kind of certain splits within the kind of wider MacDonald world in the West Highlands around about, religious lines. The MacDonalds of Glencoe, certainly by the 1690s, are probably Episcopalian. Meanwhile, many other branches of the MacDonalds across the kind of region are, perhaps some of them are already Presbyterian, but some of them are certainly still Catholic as well. The MacDonalds of Keppoch probably are at this point. And there had been kind of divisions that had formed along those lines within the kind of MacDonald world. But actually, the events of the massacre really bring together that kind of quite disparate lordship. And there's galleys of grain sent off from MacDonald lordships in Skye, and various other kind of forms of aid are brought in to supply those who have been kind of immediately dispossessed by the massacre. And there's quite a strong reaction very quickly. The various kind of Jacobite supporting clans in the area as well. So the MacDonalds of Glencoe, many of them then stay with kin in among the Stuarts of Appin for the period while they're being kind of exiled from their lands as well, or with kind of relatives more broadly as well. So there is a kind of bringing together, perhaps, of the kind of Jacobite clans. The fact that this is, as it's often put, a kind of murder under trust. So massacres of this ilk aren't actually that unusual in this period, and generally, and they're not necessarily as criminal as one might hope they were. Although this is unusual for having been carried out by soldiers of the state rather than between different clans. But certainly there are similar events that have happened that have been inflicted either by the MacDonalds of Glencoe or indeed upon the MacDonalds of Glencoe before that weren't necessarily considered quite such a scandal. It's the fact that it's this kind of active slaughter under trust. So the troops were there as guests in the households of the MacDonalds of Glencoe, and then they turn on their hosts. And this is quite a critical kind of shift. This is just not something that you do within kind of polite Highland society in this period. And it is a polite society at this period. It has its rules and kind of social mores and such, and this goes well beyond that. And so this kind of outrage spreads not just across kind of Scotland or the Highlands, but actually, to the courts of Europe, where there are many Jacobites in exile in Paris and Rome and in the Spanish court and across the kind of Low Countries and Germany too. This kind of causes quite a wave of international outreach and really is a kind of a bit of a PR coup for the Jacobite side thereafter. So there is a kind of uproar against this. At the same time, it probably does kind of bring into, at least for a short period, it does bring to heel those clans who are still kind of out in the rising. The MacDonalds of Keppoch are relatively quick to kind of give their submission thereafter. And we have this kind of period of relative peace towards the end of the kind of reign of William and Mary through the kind of earlier years of Anne's reign as well, before a kind of resurging of Jacobite activity in the kind of end of the or latter part of the 1710s and obviously the period up to the 1720s, where we get a couple of risings. There's a bit of a kind of resurgence of Jacobite activity around that period, associated with kind of dynastic changes and these sorts of things, and the kind of increasingly tenuous connection of the monarchy to the divinely appointed kind of monarch, the Stuarts.
Okay, thank you, Eddie. We've got a few questions about the coins. Helen was asking, the coin that was found in the post hole, would that be accidental or placed there for a purpose?
So it's an interesting one. I mean, certainly there's always, and there's a danger always in over-interpreting things. But there is quite a strong tradition of using silver coins within kind of foundational deposits or founding deposits, both in structures and other things. In a Scottish context. So we see from the excavations in medieval Perth, there's quite a few examples of silver coins being slotted into foundation cuts or into post holes as part of perhaps kind of a blessing on the building when it's being founded, silver coins having a kind of luck association as they kind of continue to do to this day to a certain extent. You also see it in Breshness Castle on Col. There's a silver coin, a French silver coin inserted into one of the fireplaces there during its construction, and which led to that house being called the Frenchman's House, however likely that may be. But there is a kind of association with silver coins and kind of good luck and blessing upon a structure. There's a couple of examples as well of ships where silver coins were nailed onto timbers during the construction of them as part of a kind of blessing on the ship and its kind of voyages as well and its occupants. So I would say there's a strong enough argument to be made that that kind of depositional action within the kind of founding of a structure certainly had. There's a kind of material relationship there with the coins and that around kind of luck and blessings, health, and kind of divine intercession perhaps.
Okay, thank you. And Wendy was asking another question about the coins. I think it's kind of linked to what you've just covered here, Eddie. She's saying they have a coin with a hole in it here in Northern Ireland, I think a Stewart of Galloway property from 1620, that they were told was a coin that was nailed over the front door of the house for good luck. She believes the coin's 17th century, and have you heard this explanation before?
So I've not heard specifically about nailing them to the doors of houses per se, but again, there are kind of associations of kind of nailing them to, for instance, like significant ship timbers, like the kind of bow timber of a ship during its construction, and that was certainly like two of the kind of perforated silver coins that we have are quite rough perforations, which might be sort of similar to how it would look if you've kind of pushed a thin silver coin against something and then sort of punched it with a nail into a timber beam. That would seem likely to me. The other two have quite neat circular perforations with quite a nice pattern of wear around the edge, which to my mind lends itself more to being kind of worn on a toggle or a chain. And certainly we see kind of examples of that as well. And we also see examples from this kind of period of coins being worn as parts of belts or as part of kind of garments, perhaps in part as a kind of form of bling as well. There's the really nice, from the kind of story of the Appin murder, one of the descriptions that Robert Louis Stevenson gives of Alan Brecht is that he has a belt of coins. That is perhaps one of the ways in which although that's not necessarily the purpose of Alan's belt of coins, it is perhaps one of the ways that you express your bling in a 17th, 18th century Highland context as well. Particularly if you're thinking at a period in which coinage is quite rare in this region at this time. Like most transactions are probably being done in forms of barter. Certainly your rent is not being paid in coin in the 17th century. It's being paid in butter and beef and portions of the corn that the barley and such that you bring in. Perhaps a portion of the whiskey that your wife distills, that being quite strongly a kind of female associated act. But rent is being paid in kind, and so coinage is probably quite a weird thing in this period, and that it's certainly not the usual. Most people aren't really having coins circulating in their households, and even the scatter of coins that we see across the floor of the house, the tacksman's house, that seem to mark its kind of end. Apart from the piece of gun money, actually the value of them is remarkably low again. This isn't somebody's rent money or anything of the like. Perhaps these are maybe even being used as kind of counters or kind of tokens rather than necessarily money. Our numismatist told us that you couldn't even buy a pint in Aberdeen at the time with the kind of 5 or 6 copper coins that are scattered across the floor, if that gives a kind of notion. It's not even worth, I think you're just about getting a half pint or a loaf of bread with the volume. So it's not a lot of money by any means. Which does again add to that kind of the weirdness of money in this context. It's not maybe how we conceptualize kind of working with kind of coins and the kind of prevalence of kind of money in our society. It's quite a different picture of what coins might mean and how you might interact with them and when as well, which adds to the fun of it all.
Fantastic. And this isn't a question so much as really just something that shows just how relevant what you're doing in Glencoe could be to excavations that are taking place in other parts of the world. So Erin has said here that she's currently studying and excavating an 18th century Scottish settlement in Prince Edward Island in Canada. The family were formerly tacksmen at Glenalladale in Scotland. So she's really looking forward to seeing how the material culture they find may compare to what you have found in Glencoe. So,
yeah, that'd be wonderful to I'd love to love to have a compare. So do please, you could drop us an email if you'd like.
Yeah.
I think we can circulate it perhaps. But yeah, that would be it'd be really interesting to see what that kind of diaspora material culture would compare to the sort of same status dwelling in a kind of Scottish context. And I know there have been previous excavations of tacksmen's dwellings that perhaps are more definitely kind of closer to your period. So I know there was one excavated down kind of Glendrule way, I think by Guard Archaeology, and I believe the report is available on their Scottish Archaeology Internet Reports series, or the kind of Guard Archaeology version of that on their website. And I think there was potentially also one on, I want to say Harris now, but it might have been the Uists as well, a kind of confirmed tacksman's house excavated. So they might be interesting comparisons for you as well, if that's of use. They're not, the names of the sites aren't quite rolling off the top of my tongue, but I have looked at them before.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you very much, Eddie. I think there aren't any other questions in the chat here, so it's nearly 10 past 4. So we'll wrap it up there today. So it's really just to thank yourself, Eddie, for giving such an interesting and enlightening talk. And also thanks to everybody who's joined us today as part of International Archaeology Day. So I will be sending out just a very short feedback questionnaire. It'd be really great to have some feedback about how you found today, especially if you're joining from overseas. And if you'd like to get into contact with Eddie, let me know and we can pass on his email address for any other questions that you have. Okay, thank you very much for coming.